As a public high school teacher, I loved bringing guest speakers into my classroom. My students always enjoyed a fresh face with new ideas and experiences. And 20 years ago, that guest speaker could hold their attention for a miraculous 30 minutes. But in the last few years, as all of our attention spans have dwindled, I noticed my students were struggling to engage. So I had to make a shift. And I decided to take the opportunity for students to ask questions from the end of the lesson to the very beginning. And everything changed. Now, of course, my students had to work hard to prepare those questions, but they did so with great curiosity, and then they immediately connected with a perfect stranger with personality and professionalism. It was beautiful. And it all happened because we prioritized the questions. That was when I knew that punctuation can save the world. Consider these 3 punctuation marks that typically end a sentence. The period, or as the British like to say, the full stop, the exclamation point, and the question mark. How often on a regular day do you think about these? Maybe not much. I've had more reason than most to think about them as a teacher and a lawyer and a writer, but even I hadn't thought too much about it until the last few years, and that was when I realized that punctuation is about so much more than just a grammar issue. Punctuation is key to the way that we communicate and the way that we connect. So really, it's key to how we are going to navigate this world together. Now, I could talk about all of these, but today I'm going to highlight just one, and that is the superhero of all punctuation marks. The one punctuation mark that alone can save the world. The question mark. Now, before I get into the superpowers of the question mark, though, I have to give you 2 very important warnings about it. The first is that it can be shy. Not for kids. They ask about 300 to 400 questions a day. But for adults, consider the last time you were in a difficult conversation. Did the question mark appear? Or maybe it hid in the back, while the more outgoing and aggressive full stop and exclamation point took center stage. But never mistake shy for weak. The second warning, there is an imposter in the punctuation world. I call this the imposter question. So that's when there's a question mark, but the person's not really asking you a question. So if someone's ever asked you, why are you so mad? If that made you feel worse, then it was an imposter question. They're really just saying, you shouldn't be so mad, and that's a statement. This talk is not about imposter questions. This talk is about real, genuine questions that are rooted in curiosity. So I'm going to call those curious questions. So why then is the curious question mark so powerful? Well, it's because it creates trust. Trust is central to every interaction and every relationship we have. If we trust, then we can listen and learn. And if we don't trust, then we deflect and defend. Consider this image, a ship tied up here in the harbor. And when we use periods and exclamation points, we are like this ship. We are tethered to our own ideas. But this ship is doing what ships are meant to do, sailing and exploring. And the sail is like a question mark. When you hoist a sail, you become vulnerable to the wind that hits that sail. And when we ask a question, we take a similar risk. To ask a question, we must be humble, vulnerable, honest, and brave. Let's apply these concepts to 3 different parts of our lives: family, work, and health. We'll start with family. A few years ago, my middle school age son had a growing obsession with video games. And my husband and I were a bit concerned that he would lead a lonely life. So we told him all of the reasons why video games were bad for him. Plenty of full stops and some exclamation points, and none of them moved him in the slightest. But then COVID happened, and we were forced to ask questions. And when we did, we actually learned that for his generation, video games are very social. I put aside my judgy comments, most of them, and I asked him questions about those video games. What did he like about them? Whom was he playing with? And we went from fighting about them to actually bonding about them, all because I prioritized the questions. Let's take work now. Imagine I am your supervisor. You have done this project, you've worked really hard, and I come to give you some feedback. And when I do, I say, this isn't right, I need you to do this again. What if instead I came to you and I said, I saw what you did, and I'm curious why you took that approach. Can you tell me more? Giants like Google and Microsoft know that teams function best when there's psychological safety or trust. And which of those two interactions fostered that trust? Let's take a bigger situation at work. Maybe we've got some systemic problems, and all of you are the employees with all your different perspectives and positions, and I call you in as the leader, and I am going to outline, we've got 1 hour together, all of the things we need to do differently. How we're going to do them, when, and why. And in the last 5 minutes of that meeting, I let you ask questions. Well, at that point, I'm not sure the trust is there. Maybe some of you ask a few, but most of you leave with some concerns. But what if instead we tried this approach, which is growing in popularity in workplaces, and it would go like this, still just 1 hour, but for the first 20 minutes, I would outline some of the ideas that I've been considering. I'd give you 10 minutes to ask clarifying questions, because we have to be on the same page. But then for 30 minutes, you ask me questions. But every one of your questions has to begin with, have you considered? And I cannot defend, because all I can say is thank you. I go back to my office, and some of those things I maybe had considered, but some maybe I hadn't, and I follow up. Which of these two scenarios created trust, and which fostered better ideas? Finally, for health, I've had some relevant experience in this space. 12 years ago, I used one of the most important question marks of my life when I asked a doctor, what is this lump in my breast? That very day, a radiologist told me that I had breast cancer. I was 32. We had a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, full-time job. And it turns out that with a cancer diagnosis comes a lot of questions. And so I have to be clear that curious questions can be extremely painful. So painful that sometimes you can't even ask them. And you actually have to ask other people to come and help you ask those questions. After that diagnosis, in the span of just a few weeks, we had to ask questions like, which body parts should we keep? Which should we remove? Which should we reconstruct? What kind of chemotherapy will be enough? What won't be enough? Should I shave my head or let the hair fall out? What should we tell our kids? Do we want more kids? And at what risk? And most of all, I had to ask this question of, why did my body betray me? Have you ever sat with someone who's asking questions like this? My mother sat with me, and she asked me curious questions in return. Some were really simple, like, how does that make you feel? Some were really practical, like, Would you like me to go outside so you can talk to the doctor alone? And some were questions that a mother would only ask her daughter in the middle of a really bad nightmare. In preparing for this talk, I went back to my mother and I said to her, didn't you have opinions on what we should have done at some of those stages? And she said, well, of course I did. And I said, but you didn't state things. You didn't use imposter questions. You asked real curious questions all along. And she said, well, it's your decision. It's your body. It's your life. And that's when I learned an incredible thing about curious questions. If we're curious, they allow us to form trust between each other. But if we're as brilliant and as empathetic as my mother is, they can actually allow us to help someone else create trust in themselves. Now, I absolutely believe that there is a time and a place for full stops and exclamation points. But I also believe that the question mark is the sail that we must raise so that we can explore this world together with truth and trust and hope. And so maybe next time we feel ourselves digging in or tying ourselves up to that safe harbor of our own ideas, throwing down that full stop or whirling that exclamation point, maybe instead we hoist that question mark. Because being curious, that is what the question mark was meant to do. Thank you so much.